Oh, hello. We are live. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We're gonna kick it off. And so just to start off, just the basic housekeeping rules. In the chat will be the instructions. The main thing to know is we can't hear you, we can't see you. Get as comfortable as you want, but we'd love to be able to have your interaction. So drop your questions in the chat or any feedback and comments. The best thing we were going to do in the second half is to kind of weave in your questions as part of today's chat. And with that, I will kick us off. Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Dr. Angela Lim, medical doctor and CEO of ClearHead, an innovative employee wellbeing solution. We get real and raw on the existential questions of mental health and wellbeing that's puzzled humans for millennia. Together with our expert guests, we share the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. Research has shown that time and time again, financial problems are a leading cause of stress. In fact, data from the ClearHead app showed that financial struggles were one of the top 3 causes of anxiety in the last 1 year. And a Harvard study found that constantly worrying about money can result in cognitive impairment that is equivalent to missing a full night of sleep. Thinking about how tired and overwhelmed you feel after missing out a whole night of sleep is a great way to understand how worrying about money all the time affects our overall quality of life and mental resilience. However, while the fatigue and burnout from the cost of living crisis can leave people feeling like there's nothing to be done, thankfully, this is not the case. In this webinar, Economist Brad Olsen will describe the current climate and how best to navigate it to avoid financial stress. Brad Olsen is the Chief Executive and Principal Economist at Infometrics and one of New Zealand's leading economic commentators at most major media. Brad is passionate about using economics to make better informed decisions and can communicate complex and detailed trends in a simple, relatable, and useful manner. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you for having me, Angela. It's lovely to chat.
Amazing. Well, to kick us off, why don't you share with us a little bit about how you got to becoming an economist?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, it's been a bit of a wild ride, certainly the last couple of years. Cutting my teeth in the economics game during the pandemic has been a big, trial, really, to go through all of this. Look, when I was younger, doing a bunch of work in the community, back in school and similar, I sort of realized that numbers were pretty convincing to people. And so sort of over time, I've tried to use numbers to everyone's advantage, because really the big thing for me is that numbers are persuasive. People like talking about them. They are convincing to a lot of people, but economics is often seen as real boring, real dry, real hard to understand. It shouldn't be, because the sort of better we get at talking about these things, the more information people have, generally the better decisions that people make. And so my entire thing is I want to make sure that economics is understandable and useful. So certainly with this webinar, right, the idea is let's get some good, useful information to people so they can think a little bit differently about some of those big challenges out there. And they are challenging, but there is something that everyone can do about them. They can think in a different way. They can have a few strategies to talk about. And so that's my entire thing. If I can make sure it's understandable and useful, people are going to make better decisions.
100%. And if it's not boring, that's what you said too.
Exactly.
Well, I'm sure there's going to be very many practical things that we're going to take away from today. And I'm sure we all like having the dinner table talk around the common issues that we're all facing, and money is one that affects us all. So maybe let's kick us off with, what is the cost of living crisis, and is it predicted to end anytime soon?
Yeah, so we are making a lot of progress there, but you're right. Let's go through a little bit of history about how we got here without it becoming too boring. I mean, cost of living crisis, the old cozy living, as everyone talks about at the moment, we normally try and keep the annual inflation rate at about sort of 2%. Now, long story short, we know that in the economy, you look out in life, stuff generally gets more expensive over time. That's because the economy is expanding and the like, but also because people are making more money over time. So more money equals more spending generally equals higher prices. Now, what we try and do in the economy in normal times is keep all of that to a Goldilocks zone, normally about 2%, so that people's wages rise over time and those prices don't get too out of kilter. Through the pandemic, over the last couple of years, we've seen inflation spike far higher. So instead of that normal sort of 2%, a year rate, we had it go up to a peak of 7%. So long story short, that was because we were all spending a lot of money coming out of the pandemic. Interest rates were low. Households didn't have to spend as much on their mortgage. They had more free money. They spent that free money in the economy. But because the entire globe had gone through a big supply shock, we weren't making as much stuff. And so all of a sudden you had a lot more money chasing not quite as many goods. And that meant that the prices were bid up, inflation came through. So we saw that inflation spike at 7.3% back in 2022. That was the highest rate of inflation that New Zealand had seen going back into the 1990s, similar for Australia and the likes of the rest of the world. So a real big hit. Coming through to now, the latest annual inflation rate is at 3.3%. So much better number, much closer to that sort of 2% midpoint that we want to look for. But I think the difference here, right, is that it's 3% on top of 7% last year, on top of 7% the year before. So long story short, everyone's spending a lot more. However, what we're seeing at the moment is there's not quite as much additional coming forward. A lot of shops out there, they're not getting great sales, so they're trying to keep their sort of pricing pressures a bit lower. And so long story short, we think that those sort of pricing elements are starting to come back. Look, I think the easiest way you can sort of see that is people when people are going to do their grocery shop, for example, things are generally a little bit more settled. You're seeing a few more deals and discounts coming through for some of the big retailers. So long story short, life is expensive, but we don't think it continues to get sort of even more silly expensive each and every month.
Well, I guess it's good to know that we're finally trending in the direction that we're wanting. But as you said, this is in some ways we're still needing to work through the backlog of the last 2 years of high inflation, and with any transition period, it's always going to be painful. So obviously you talked about inflation as the primary driver of the cost of living. But what are the other common financial challenges that you see everyday people experiencing?
Yeah, the other big one is just housing costs in general, and particularly at the moment, right, it's around interest rates and to a degree rent still, depending on who you are and what your family situation is. You might be paying rent, you might be paying a mortgage. They've both gone up quite a bit, particularly for the likes of interest rates, though, of course, they're a lot higher. And I think part of that is that you go back to sort of 2020, 2021, you could get an interest rate starting with 2%. Money was real cheap at that point. And so that was it was a lot easier to repay. At the moment, we know that, some people are paying sort of 50%, nearly half of their entire average household income to repay a mortgage in its first year. So those costs are quite steep. And I know talking to people that is something that weighs on their mind. And I think that comes through to a lot about the sort of priorities that people use their money for. When someone's pay comes into their bank account every fortnight or month or whatever it might be, you don't sort of spend it on a whole bunch of stuff all at once. You go through in your mind a bit of a priority, right? You go, okay, I need to pay for a roof over my head. So either your rent or your mortgage gets paid first. Then you need to go and get some food. That's pretty vital as well, and some of your other bills, internet and power and that sort of thing. Need some petrol for the car. Those are generally your essentials. A lot of other stuff sort of drops out the other end. But that housing cost piece really is something that people are paying a lot more attention to. And it is challenging out there. Although, of course, in the last week, we've started to see the Reserve Bank cut the official cash rate for the first time. Most of the retail banks have now cut their own interest rates. So although you don't go straight on to a cheaper rate, when people are looking to refix their mortgage, they will start to see probably a little bit of relief.
Well, as you said, with inflation, our salary doesn't increase as fast as, for example, the grocery bill, for example, our mortgage rates that we have to repay. And, I think the other big one that we're seeing a lot is with all the natural disasters, insurance has also gone up as well. In that context, what are how would you kind of advise someone to think about if my pay hasn't increased anywhere near inflation and now that's really kind of cutting into what's available? What's the best way to manage my stress if I just know that I have maybe if I was already living paycheck to paycheck, or that I just don't have any more disposable income to cut from?
Totally. I think the first and best thing is to talk about it. And look, we'll get into some of the actual strategies in that in a second. But honestly, one of the big things we often find is that New Zealanders don't talk about money a lot. And so people will sort of package that up themselves, and they won't be talking to other people who might well have some advice or similar. So, whether that's family or friends that you can just sort of take a load off, or really, a financial advisor, your bank person. I think probably the big one is it depends a little bit on what your cost structure is as a household, right? So if you're someone that's got quite a big mortgage and paying quite a lot on the interest repayments, then generally it is going to talk to the bank in the first instance and saying to them, look, you know what my earnings are. Let's talk about what this looks like. And sometimes there might be some changes that can happen. Sometimes you might have to think about some of those bigger shifts around the housing market. But I think sort of the worst thing to do there is to not do anything when things become challenging. So that's a big one. I think the other one that we're certainly seeing a lot at the moment, and you actually see this in some of the data, is that people are also thinking a lot about how they reduce their costs over time in other areas. I think the big one is probably on the nice to haves. So, we know that people are taking fewer trips away in that at the moment. They're being a lot more careful with their money. So, tourism pulling back, people are sort of having staycations, staying at home and what have you. They're also, though, particularly in the food space, being a lot more careful with what they buy. So, of course, spending goes back onto the essentials. And one thing we've certainly seen the last couple of years is that the likes of your fruit and vegetable costs, of course, have gone up quite a bit. And so people, I think, are sort of staying away from that a bit more. Things have returned a bit more to normal pricing at the moment, but there's, of course, those big seasonalities. So I went down to my supermarket, I think it was last night, and, there's a big sign over the tomatoes saying these are out of season. That's why they're like $13, $14 a kilo. If you really need one, maybe you'll get one, but not many. But then you come into summer and things are going to get cheaper for the likes of tomatoes. Other things are going to get more expensive. So thinking about shopping seasonally and similar is important. And look, to be honest, depending on where you are, if you really are doing it tough, then we know that people really are thinking about swapping down in terms of the sort of prices they're willing to pay. So we had a look at some data, interestingly enough, between 2019 and 2023 at what Kiwis spend on. And we've generally been seeing that over time, New Zealanders spent less on the likes of mints at the supermarket, spent more on steak. You're actually seeing it flip out the other way. And that's just because, again, people are very naturally going, look, I'm finding it tough. I've got to sort of make some savings somewhere. That's a little bit where it starts to come through.
Interesting when you think about the housing comment you made before, it's stuff like if you can't make your usual repayment because the mortgage rate has gone up, look at, for example, instead of taking 10 years to pay back, maybe extending it to 20 years so that you've got giving yourself more time to pay across a longer period, which means you have to make a smaller amount with each repayment. So maybe let's talk a bit of some of these practical strategies. You've often said, the best thing is to put pen to paper in addition to kind of talking to someone about it, so that you can take the mental load of trying to do it in your head, and instead to create like spreadsheets or budgeting. Where's the best place to start? Or do you have resources that people can look to?
Look, I think I'm a huge fan of an Excel spreadsheet as an economist. We live in the numbers, but if whether it's a spreadsheet or just a bit of notepad that you write things on, having some sort of idea of your budget is I think a big start. I think a lot of people do have them, but to be fair, I know a lot of friends who also don't yet. So just getting a bit of a budget to start with over look, what are my big costs? What do I know about? Because sometimes you then start to make the connection of, I didn't realize I was paying this much for something. Is there a cheaper option, or do I really need it? So, jot that all down. Jot down, what your weekly or monthly or fortnightly repayment is for your mortgage, or how much your rent costs. How much are you budgeting for food, for fuel, and those sorts of things. How much is it costing you for your insurance, for your pet? We know that a lot of people out there have got pets, and by goodness, they're becoming more expensive as well. But then you start to get down, and I think once you've sort of done that, often people then, after they've done the big ones, go, what are the next set of costs that I've got? Oh, I'll go and have a look at my bank statement or my credit card statement or whatever it might be. And that's where you often find some of those fascinating ones where, you might have got a subscription to Netflix or something a while back, and actually you haven't used it in a while, or I thought my sister was paying it, she thought I was paying it. Turns out I was paying it. Do I actually need that sort of thing? And so just going through, look, what am I spending out on? How do I become a little bit more condensed with my money is a big one. Because I think at the moment, right, people are generally have been up until the last couple of years going, how do I grow my wealth? Totally love that idea, and we can get back to it in a moment, but I think it's almost shifted around a bit where people are now going like, how do I not necessarily go backwards? Because it is tough at the moment. So getting that budget down, I think, is an important start. We know as well that often what people are suggested to do, and I think this is a great move myself, is sort of break up how you think about your finances. So either have a few multiple bank accounts where you put different money. Some money goes into the account for your mortgage or for your rent. Some goes into sort of the food and utilities account. Some goes into the fun money account because you still got to live. But you sort of allocate that budget so you're not just sort of spending it all. You've got a little bit of a tighter control on it. And what that often means is that you can then do probably one of my favorite and most important financial tips is you sort of come up with that thinking where you build a bit of an emergency fund. So if something does happen, you can try and you've got a bit of an emergency fund first. Second, you then think about your debts, because everyone wants to save and everyone wants to think about their money, but there's a real important piece there. If you've got, credit card debt, for example, it's costing you 29%. That's going to sort of kill your savings faster than you can fill them in. So thinking about what your debts and your repayments look like, and then eventually thinking about savings and investment out the other side. But those are sort of that's the pathway. If a friend came to me and said, look, Brad, I know you're not a financial advisor, but generally what would you say, as some sort of first steps? Those are some of the good ones. Just gives you a good foundation, good base to start from.
You've alluded to this a little bit, which is that, as part of the squeeze, people are cutting down on that discretionary, leisurely type of spend like travel. But we also know that, being able to have the ability to spend for travel helps improve people's well-being, gives them something to look forward to in all the grind that is happening. So how can someone still, I guess, have these little luxuries in the context that they don't maybe have that breathing room anymore? You sort of briefly alluded about, reviewing that in the budget. And I guess what I want to definitely alert people is that, when you're doing this budget, don't go like, okay, therefore I remove everything that's nice about my life, because that also removes this motivation to love. And we don't want you kind of losing that. So pass it to you, Brad, on how to think about that.
Oh, exactly. And I mean, I suspect it's similar, right, to when people talk about diets. Like if you just go completely cold turkey on everything, you're probably not going to stick to it, because all of a sudden you're just boring. You're eating the boring stuff and you've got nothing to look forward to on your plate. And look, I like to think of myself as a foodie, so that's quite important to me. So no, you're totally right. I think often what happens, the practical thing here, right, is it depends a little bit on how much flex you've got. If you're struggling to pay the mortgage, then we're probably talking about, really cutting it back. But let's sort of take it through the first steps. I think the first step is often people who go, look, I was thinking to do an international holiday or flying somewhere, because flights are flipping expensive at the moment. Oh my goodness. So, you're sort of switching that back and going, maybe I drive somewhere. Fuel's still expensive, but that keeps me a little bit closer to home. So, where are we going? What sort of activities are sort of nearby or around me? So that's part of it. I think what we're also seeing, and certainly this goes back to that sort of, allocating funds, is instead of sort of making a real big budget for travel, because that is expensive, going, what is something that maybe I don't do that I do a bit more regularly, but don't do sort of as extravagantly. So instead of, one big international trip a year, maybe it's that, my partner and I go out to dinner at sort of a nice restaurant, but not super nice, once a month. Or we decide we're going to do fish and chips every sort of fortnight or whatever it might be. And we budget that. We put the money away specifically because we know how much it's broadly going to cost. And therefore, we've got that little thing to look forward to, but it's not going to fully break the bank. So I think it's about having those sort of almost milestones around finances that people have. And that's why, like I say, having an extra few accounts, and banks are pretty open about doing that for you. Having another free account on your as part of your banking set means that you can sort of move that money around rather than going, oh, I've got this big bank account, it's got all of my money in it, and I've got to mentally sort of check, oh, I've spent $30 there and I spent $20 there. If it goes into those different accounts, it means you can sort of see it at a glance how much you've got for all of those different things in your life.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to recognize as well. Like, as you said, having these little buckets, and you briefly sort of alluded about talking about making sure to also have an emergency fund because life happens. And I remembered a statistics, I can't remember the actual quote, which is that in America, like I think majority of Americans are, I don't know, like several thousands away from a bankruptcy, basically, if they incur like a really major bill. When you talk about this emergency fund, what does that mean? Is it like 3 months of paycheck, or like be good to kind of help people understand what it means in terms of that rainy day kitty?
Totally. And I think, again, it comes down a little bit to the resource. The ideal, the Goldilocks zone, is generally people talk about having 3 months of your salary sort of broadly available. And that is for, like you say, worst case scenario. If something happened to your job tomorrow, if you got fired, if the business got closed down or similar, and you literally had no way of immediately clicking your fingers and getting some income to keep you going, how do you sort of continue to pay those costs? So that's the ideal. But even sort of before that, there's the whole thing of what happens if a big unexpected unbudgeted cost comes up. If the dog eats some chocolate tonight and you need to go and take them to the vet, that's going to cost you a little bit. If the car breaks down or someone breaks into your car, you might have insurance, you might not. How do you pay for the excess? How do you go and pay for the new tire, whatever it might be? So it's sort of just having that little bit of sort of safety comfort money to sort of keep you going. Now, I totally get that's quite difficult, right, when people are paying or living paycheck to paycheck. But that's why sort of starting small, if you can get to that 3 months, definitely ideal. But even something just means you've got a little bit more security as you start to think about things, because it does give you that sort of little bit of safety as you head forward. So generally 3 months, but anything you can bring forward, I think, is useful.
Yeah, I think when we think about mental health and people who, for example, might take their life because things get really difficult, is what can you do to kind of just remove any trigger and anything that allows you not to feel completely overwhelmed and sort of hopeless is all a broader safety net for you and your family. Obviously some of our listeners are couples. And when you talk about these accounts, do you sort of recommend people do joint accounts or like separate accounts? How do you think about that?
Oh, it's so tricky. And I think this is one of the challenges, right? Like talking about finances in general is difficult for New Zealanders. I feel like talking about money with your partner before you're really good partners, is tricky as well. Now, I mean, look, all of this is general advice, and sort of if you need to go and talk to a professional in that for all the good stuff. But I think the first bit is talking through a little bit and being upfront about like what is your earnings, but also what is your spending look like, because that can help dictate it. Some people I know, they are high earners and they are also very high spenders. They work to sort of fund their lifestyle. And hey, if that's how they want to do it, then it's their money and go hard. Of course, if you're then coupling up with someone who might be like a real hardcore saver, then it makes it quite difficult if you're like, well, we'll sort of both contribute the same sort of money. So a few variety of things, again, depending on your comfort levels. What you could do, for example, is either come up with a joint account, that's true, or you could even just in those early stages say, look, let's say that you do have a spender and a saver in your couple, just to as an example, you might say to the saver, look, let's open an extra bank account under your name, and the spender will sort of send that amount of money each week for just the essentials. It might be that, look, we know that the power bill is going to be $50 a week, and we know that the rent's going to be this much a week, and we know that the internet's going to be this much a week. So we'll fund sort of those key and always needing to be paid things into one person, and they can, run and coordinate it, almost like a flat account, right? For other things, for other parts of your lifestyle, you might go, actually, food, for example. One person's working a super physical job and needs certain things, needs icebox and drinks that to keep them cool in the summer. So maybe everyone pays for their food separately, or you do them together, or whatever works. I think as well, you often find, and I think of my grandparents like this. My grandfather got given an allowance each week by my grandmother, and that was physical cash. Like, he'd get handed money after she went to the bank every week or fortnight. That's totally not for a lot of people. I get that, but for other people, it's almost like, oh, here is the set money that I can spend on other things. So I think first bit, like we were talking about before, Angela, just sit down, have a bit of a chat, and get on that same page. Because I think the worst thing that happens is when you don't do that, everyone's got a preconception about what your spending or savings habits are, and then all of a sudden it goes wrong. So I think sitting down, thinking about both the spending element as well as the earnings bit, and then figuring out what you do, where you do have sort of shared values, and where you go, actually, yep, we're totally aligned on this stuff, then we can do it together. If there's areas where you're not, maybe that's something to keep a bit more separate to start with.
You're sort of like alluding, obviously, to like differences in, I guess, personality or styles of what people's relationship is with money. Do you notice a generational difference between how people are saving or spending money? And, is there anything we need to be mindful of in that context?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, I think we know from the numbers that young people generally don't have nearly as much, both in terms of income or wealth or savings, of course. That's fairly natural. I think it's also, though, that because people are buying houses later in life, and that's because houses are more expensive and similar, it has sort of changed how people think about their money sort of in the earlier stages, in a sense. So, some people will be just putting money physically into the bank. It'll sit in their bank account and hopefully it makes a little bit of interest. Top tip, by the way, for people, go and check what interest rate you're getting on your money in the bank, because often you'll have like the money that or the account that your money comes into will often get a very, very low interest rate. You might be able to get like a better savings account that gives you sort of better interest if you put like $20 a month or something in. So go and have a look at that, because that's often where people lose out on some easy money. But then, people are also putting their money into, stocks and similar, not necessarily because they're super keen to be, Wolf of Wall Street style. They're just actually a bit more keen. They're going, hey, that's making some money at the moment. I'll sort of put it in there. I think the big thing there is that it feels like a lot of work to get involved in that sort of investing side, and it seems a lot scary and risky, and I sort of understand that. I think the big thing is understanding, one, what your risk tolerance is, but two, what you actually want your money to do for you. Like when I put money into my KiwiSaver, for example, one, I never notice it because it goes out of my paycheck. It never comes to my bank account. But two, I need that in like 40, 50 years time. I'm not even 30 yet. So like, I don't really care if it's going up or down week by week. I just want to know that it's generally trending this direction over time. And I think that's the other thing is sort of understanding how you want your money to work for you also means or changes how you interact with it. My KiwiSaver, never really look at it, never really touch it, never want to, because it's long term. If I was, though, needing that money a little bit more short term, if I was thinking of buying a house or something, for example, I do need to keep a bit of a close eye on it. I probably don't want it to be moving around much. So I think it's just the different variety of options that is different so much for different generations at the minute.
I think the nuance here as well is to simplify stuff. If like Brad just said, that the current inflation rate's about 3%. And if you're getting 2% on your savings account, you probably might want to review that, because just keeping the money in the savings account is essentially your money is shrinking because you're losing it just on inflation alone. So you do probably want to put in something that at least grows your money faster than inflation. So that's kind of a quick rule of thumb to think about. The other rule of thumb to think about as well is in the context of, as Brad says, if you're younger, you have more time if something goes wrong with the money to make it back. And starting early and not thinking about it allows you to kind of grow your wealth much faster than sort of big lump sums. But of course, if you're in a retiree age, or if, as you said, you're going to need to use that money for a mortgage, that you have to make sure the money's there. Thinking about the risk profile or the aggressiveness of the portfolio is really important as well. And so each one to each one, and obviously to make sure you talk to a financial advisor. We're not providing financial advice on this podcast.
I think as well, a big thing there is like by the time if something does go wrong as well, being thinking about how you respond to that is important. I mean, you look back, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, the US stock market, for example, went berserk. It fell a couple of percentage points. The Japanese market fell like 14, worst since 1987. And everyone was like, oh my word, like I've lost so much money. It's just, completely and utterly stuffed. Oh my word. The next day it had come back to normal. Like it literally took 24 hours. And I remember at the time, we were getting all these calls from media. Everyone was like, what do we do? And I was like, honestly, close that number. Don't look at it for a week, because two things are true there. One, if it's already happened, you can't do a lot about it. And in fact, you haven't lost any money until you change something. And so again, that sort of risk profile where I'm going personally, for me, I was going, I don't need the money for 40 years. I reckon at some point in the next 40 years, it'll probably bubble up the other way. And it did pretty quickly. We saw that at the start of COVID as well. Markets completely dropped out. Bloodbath was being talked about, red ink everywhere. 3 months later, the stock market was broadly back where it was to start with. So a little bit of that, over the long term, that is their expectation that things will even out. And I think because of that as well, there's this big thing, and you talked about, getting in early and versus lump sums. No one is that good at timing the market. Like no one is that smart out there to be, again, Wolf of Wall Street that like makes the deal of the century. And if you are, like, honestly, give me a call afterwards. We'll see if we can make something work. But look, no one is.
Can you give me a call?
Yeah.
I want to get into that.
Exactly, but genuinely that doesn't happen. And so I think, it's one of those things where over time, if you get in early, then compound interest means that you will grow on top of your growth. The other bit, and I think this is probably important to think about as well, is that when something changes in your life, use that as a bit of a check-in for your own finances. When you're starting to move from, say, flatting to thinking about buying a house, when you get into a new relationship, if you are thinking of having kids or whatever it might be, if you're changing jobs, use that to think about your finances for a second. Go, actually, is everything set up in the right way? Am I moving in the right direction? Because if you're having kids or whatever, you might need to think about your insurance, or if there's income to look after them in the future and what have you. And the other thing is, I always recommend it, like an annual sort of financial detox, spring clean, look around is always useful. Go and check out if you're getting the best deal on your mobile phone, on your power provider. Make sure that when the landlord's coming up, go and gather some evidence from online. And my rent, for example, I've managed to keep my landlord to no increases the last 3 years, because every time they want to, I'm like, but here's the data, and they're like, oh no, I don't really want to go to the tenancy tribunal, so we can try and keep it a bit lower. So like go through those steps of, you're looking at your stuff and, hey, do we need to have Netflix and Disney Plus? Which one do we look at the most? Oh, we'll get rid of one of those. It's those small things that actually over time make you a lot of money. And there's so many things, I think, where we often just get locked into costs and we go, oh, it's too hard to change. And I get that. Sometimes it does take a lot of time and effort. But also sometimes there are not insignificant savings that you can make.
I don't think I've ever heard of anyone bargaining down a landlord ever. I think you officially, you might need a Brad Olsen economics degree to do that.
Well, it's one of those things. Like, I mean, the big one there is even just go and check, and like, because one of my flatmates at one point in my life was like, hey, someone down the road who's like renting a very similar house to ours is paying like way more than us. How'd you get our rent so cheap? And I was like, well, our rent is just like average in the area. Here's the website. It's tenancy. I'll find it. I'll find it on this while we go, because it's a good little one just to go, actually, what is the standard in my area? Now, sure, your landlord might still be putting it up or similar, but sometimes even if you can limit that increase, it can make a big difference.
Yeah, totally. Or even just like Trade Me, right? Like looking at what other, if you rents around the same area, what are they currently advertising it? And so if the landlord goes, I'm putting it up by $100 a week, you're like, okay, and I'm moving out soon because
exactly, and
you have power to.
Totally. Sometimes that's difficult. I get that, like people often say, well, there might not be a lot of rentals, might not be many rentals in my area, and that's totally true. But I think also having having that evidence behind you makes it a lot easier. So if you if you Google market rent tenancy services NZ, you should find it, and you can put in your suburb, and it will tell you like what the average, like the median rental price in that is. So at least you've got a bit of an idea.
You obviously, alluded not just to rent, but a few other things like power, etc. Like, so is there just like one website you go to, or you're just saying go Google for each thing that you're trying to optimize for?
There's different things. I mean, the likes of Power Switch does really well for the likes of energy. There's one for broadband as well, which completely escapes my mind at the moment. But again, you can often compare deals, because I think the other thing is that sometimes there's not a huge amount between them, but it's also that you need to maximize the advantages you've got. So, like for example, our flat in Wellington, we've got 3 free hours of power a night between 9 p.m. and midnight. And let me tell you, at 9:01, the heat pump is getting cranked on, the dryer is on, the washing machine, the dishwasher, everything is on. Not so much to overload the breaker, just be careful with that. But if I can, I'll try and leave my washing in that until later in the night, so I can take advantage of that free power a bit more. So it's just small stuff like that means that you might not be making a lot of money, but at least you're not unnecessarily spending a lot more money as well.
Right, and then that is like your avocado on toast that you've been able to save for the weekend to enjoy with your nice coffee, for example.
Definitely. I mean, gosh, it hasn't been avocados recently. I remember a year ago it was just kumara. You were having a roast and you couldn't get it in kumara because they were costing like $16 a kg. Oh my word.
That makes sense. You briefly alluded to it, which is like, reviewing where your financial situation is depending on whether life changes are happening. I guess, in the context of first time buyers for homes, is there ever a good time when thinking about that type of things, or is it just when you can get onto the property ladder, you should try?
The 1950s were a pretty good time for first-time purchases.
Okay, do you have a time machine with that advice as well?
Exactly, without a time machine. And look, even if they did exist, I bet you anything they'd be pretty expensive. So, look, I think the tough one there is that not necessarily. Like, you've got to be a little bit careful, of course, about it. And I think the big thing there is that if you can get money from the bank, the big thing there is a little bit to test yourself over what if interest rates did go higher. Because the banks will test you. They'll generally test you at a higher rate than what the current interest rate is. But they're not as worried about how you find that money. They're just happy that you can pay it. So you might be on less than the baked beans diet and they'd be happy enough. So I think like the useful thing there is, okay, if the interest rate was up at, X percent, way higher than what it is at the moment, what would that mean? What would that mean for me as a household? Okay, I'd need to probably cut out, all of my travel. There wouldn't, and maybe no fish and chips every 2 weeks, whatever it might be. Or, it would only be that I might need to cancel a Netflix subscription or whatever it might be, just sort of understanding what that difference is going to be. That's sort of very much a part of it. But there's a lot of other things I think that people go through to sort of consider what their financial situation is, and probably importantly where they want to get to. Like I know a lot of people, for example, they also when they split up their money, they try and sort of keep a proportion for savings, but they split it up. Sometimes it's long-term savings, maybe for a house or something. Sometimes it's also just so short-term savings for a little holiday or whatever. The big other one when it comes to buying a house is also thinking a little bit about what you're considering buying. If it's your first house, you're probably not going to have the mansion straight away. Like that's house 5 or number 6 as you move through. And so I think considering as well about those other costs. How much is your public transport going to cost you to get into your office or not, or your workplace, wherever it might be? If you can work from home, great, but what's the setup at home? Is it a soundproofed room? Is it a cold room? Is it a warm room? How does that sort of work? Are you just working at the kitchen table, and are you going to be comfortable around that? Sort of taking all of those bits into account. And I think the big one at the moment is that although it's difficult to finance a house, and that's a struggle at the moment, totally agree, there are quite a lot of houses out there, so competition is a bit more of a thing. You can actually pick and choose your houses. But the other, and sort of one that even I didn't realize how much was out there was go and talk, go and have a bit of a look, talk to people who have done it before, because actually the amount of help out there for first home buyers is not insignificant. The government has gotten rid of the first home loan, the first home grant, but there is still the first home loan, which might be able to give you a bit more of a leg up. Of course, understanding how your KiwiSaver is working for you at the moment, how long you've been in, how much money you're putting in means will dictate how much you can get out the other side as well. So I think it's one of those things, you want to be thinking about your finances and sort of house buying a long time before you buy the house. If you're sort of at the point of you're like, wow, love that house, think I've got enough money, then you go through these things, you might well be a little bit disappointed. But if you're going, hey, look, sitting there, maybe in about a year's time, could be thinking about buying a house, now is the time then to go, how do I sort of make sure I'm all structured up so I've got everything I could possibly need to put me in the best position to buy?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that actually this is something that because I guess if you look at historical data, house prices kept going up. So it was a reasonable enough, I guess, investment decision to buy a home. But I guess as prices get higher and interest rates stay high, the economics of whether it might be actually more cost effective to rent a place that you really like versus buying might also, I guess, that dynamic changes. Do you have any advice around that? Whether someone should consider just renting for life and that's okay?
Totally. I mean, it's tricky because I think the other big thing with that is it's not just on the financial side, it's on how you use it. So, like, look, to be perfectly blunt, everyone always asks me, how are you an economist? You must be silly, you don't own a house. I've spent 49% of this year in my flat in Wellington. Like, I just wouldn't get that much out of buying a house at the moment. Personally, I wouldn't be there. So part of it comes down to that. Part of it also comes down to, how much do you value that security of having your own house and doing whatever you want with it, because that can be a big thing for people, particularly when you start thinking about having kids or similar, or you want a dog or what have you. Often that security of doing it yourself is a big thing. Equally, it means you've got to do all the maintenance and similar. Something goes wrong at my flat, not really my responsibility as long as I didn't cause it. Like, that's on the landlord to do. So it depends a little bit in terms of how involved you want to get and how you sort of work all of those things out. Equally, sure, I don't spend a whole lot of time at my flat and I don't have to do the maintenance. But, within a year, I could get kicked out and have to find somewhere else to live and have to move all of my stuff and find a new way to the supermarket, find some new friends around there. So it is a little bit, I think, depends on what you're wanting out of it. And look, what your financial position might be. There are enough people out there that, look, it is not currently particularly easy. There's not a real clear pathway for how they buy a house. So renting is a real necessity. And I think for that as well, is recognizing how do you get the most out of that is important.
Yeah, and also I think just being really open to searching out the different models out there. So I think often when people think about buying their first home and then having to service the mortgage when things get tough, actually you have a spare bedroom, like rent it out. It might not be ideal, but it helps you pay the bills. Or I think there are some schemes like rent to own that's out there. So there are increasingly ways in which you can try and get your foot in the ladder, even if the ladder is kind of being pulled up at the moment. Anything else you would add kind of in the context of people who might be doing it tough with high mortgage rate? Anything else that we need to think about in that context?
A few other things. Look, the bank of mum and dad is a real popular and often quite important part at the moment. And I guess the thing there is again, talk to family in that before it becomes a big issue rather than sort of after. But look, I know a lot of people whose mum and dads or family members have helped them out into homes. Sometimes that was the only sort of opportunity for them. So look, depends on how you get on with your family and similar. That might be an option. I know a lot of people as well though who are like buying as either two couples buying a house together or similar and what have you. And I think the big thing to realize there is that when you're thinking about buying, often it's not that this will be your forever home. It's your first home. And so it might well be that, you live with that other couple sort of like even more adult renting for a couple of years. And then eventually, as you continue to sort of move through your financial journey, someone might sell out, someone might move to a different place, couples might break up. And so I think, there are options there. It's just important to have, done your homework, make sure you've got, an agreement in place for what all of those things do. A lot of this, Angela, I think really does come down to that whole, prior planning prevents poor performance. It is a real big one of jumping feet first is often a bit of a dangerous game financially in all things. And so sort of being a little bit more of a, hold on, let's stop for a second, breathe, work it through, make a plan, often does you really well. But there are definitely some options. I think also, let's be blunt, there are some challenging times out there. There is no harm in putting up your hand and saying, actually, this is looking pretty difficult to do. We know that a lot of New Zealanders are doing that at the moment. In fact, we're seeing a lot more properties being listed on the markets because people are going, look, I'm not yet getting kicked out of my house and I'm not yet not able to pay the mortgage, but I'm honest, I'm close. And so I do have to think about that. And so more people are thinking about downsizing or moving around. And I think, again, doing that in sort of a more methodical way means that you've got a bit more control. You feel a lot more in control. That does wonders as you go forward, rather than having to sort of jump and react and jump scare to everything that's happening around you.
Nice. I often joke at work that I used to have I did scholarship math in high school, but math is probably not my strength at the moment. But one of the questions that I think we should explore is around, should I, with the money that I have, should I be paying down the loan or should I be putting it into savings? How do you help people think through where the money should go?
Totally. So there's sort of the general school of thought is that it depends a little bit on the interest rate that you're getting. And I know, having just scrolled through the comments and that a bit more as well, there's a question about student loans. Now, student loans are a different topic. Let's park them for a second. We'll come back in just a minute. But for general loans, I think it's the big thing. If you're sitting there, right, and you've got a personal loan from the bank or credit card debt or similar, and it's coming through at let's say 25%, just to make it easy. If you're putting your money into savings and your savings are getting 3-4%, then you're losing more money with the repayments and the interest that are coming through than you're making on the savings side. So you get rid of the big credit items first where you can, if they've got a high interest rate. Get rid of those quicker. Actually is going to save you more money in the long term. Once you've got rid of those, it's then thinking about, well, how do I structure it? Because you might well find, for example, that you're paying a mortgage rate of, I don't know, let's say 6.5% at the moment. Now, you might be getting sort of 6% in a term deposit. You might be getting 3-4% in the bank, and so you might go, well, I'll be better to put my money towards the mortgage. True, but you might not be able to, right? Not all mortgages let you just pay off extra bits. Sometimes there's a bit of a limit around how much you can pay. And so what you'll often find people do is they'll put that sort of money away in the side. They'll put it into a term deposit or something a little bit safer, so that when their loan comes up for the next refixing, they might be able to sort of put some of that spare cash on it at that point and sort of lower how much it's going to hit. But the general thinking is to look at those various interest rates, but almost always how it normally works is that your personal loans and your credit card interest rates, they're going to be way higher than anything else in life. Get rid of those first. Then it's a bit more of a call between the likes of your home loan and your savings and similar. Now, on the student loan, the big bit is whether or not you're in New Zealand and staying in New Zealand, or if you're going overseas or thinking of going overseas. If you're thinking of going overseas or you are going overseas, your repayments on your student loan can become a real crippler on the financial front real quick. And so, yep, definitely worth thinking about how much you can pay off or how much you think you're going to earn overseas and if that can offset it. If you're in New Zealand, almost always it is worth paying your student loan at just the normal rate. There is very little point in paying off your student loan faster. And the reason for that is because your student loan in New Zealand is as a proportion of your income. So there's no interest being charged on it in New Zealand, and so there's no need to get rid of it any quicker. Some people are like, look, I just want to get rid of it, and I think that's totally fine, but really it'd almost be better, let's say you're paying, I don't know, $20 a week off your student loan, just to make the math simple, and you said, actually, I could pay $30 a week. You'd almost be better to put that extra $10 a week away into a term deposit or something, get a little bit of interest, and then eventually help pay off your student loan towards the end. So student loans, different. It depends on if you're going to get a house and all those other things. But in general, Personal loans and credit cards, worst things, get rid of them. Then you're into sort of thinking about the likes of your savings, your emergency fund, your home loan, and then student loans a little bit further out to the side.
That's cool. Let's change gear a little bit. I mean, as part of being able to stretch your dollar, people are looking at, for example, stuff on Amazon or like online shopping like Shein, where you can buy things that are, I guess, cheaper, but maybe not as good quality, or maybe have like questionable ethical practices. What are your sort of like, your advice around thinking about managing the ability to keep your dollar going further versus sort of maybe compromising on values that for some people is really important for them?
Definitely. I mean, we've seen a big uptick in overseas purchases through, online stores and similar. In fact, earlier this year, for the over the last 12 months up till March 2024, there was a 20% increase in the number of low-value imports. So imports under $1,000 going directly to people. So that's people shopping on your Temus and that sort of thing. Excuse me. And that is very much people who are going, look, I still need to buy some stuff, but I need to get it cheap because I just don't have the money to pay sort of full price in the store at the moment. So I think the big thing there is it depends a little bit on what I'm looking for. If I needed some contact lenses, for example, I'm probably going to still want to pay a reasonable dollar for that because the things are going in my eyes. I don't want them to sort of mess up. If I'm thinking about, a toy or something that I don't need to use as much, I don't know, I need a new laptop stand or similar, maybe I'm happy to compromise on the cost a little bit there because I can sort of get away with something that might be a little bit lower quality as well. So I think it is that sort of, like I say, it's the quality quantity sort of trade-off, and the price comes into that a lot as well. What we're also seeing, though, and I think interesting, is people that are also going, is there an opportunity for me, maybe not on all of those sites, but on Instagram or other things, to actually be a bit more entrepreneurial? I'm struggling at the moment. I've got a bit of free time at night. Am I an artist? Am I good at dog walking? Whatever it might be, can I make some spare money on the side to try and ease my financial journey? And I think there's a lot more of that sort of side hustle culture coming through at the moment. People thinking about, how do I make not a huge amount, but just enough to make life a bit easier?
I think along those lines, I think about this saying that says it's expensive to be poor, which is that people often have to buy lower quality goods if they're poor, in smaller quantities rather than, being able to optimize, for bulk buying or, and then over time, actually, it's more expensive to do what they do, which is buy the $50 boots 10 times versus buying the $500 boots that last them 10 years kind of thing. So be keen to hear your thoughts on, how to help people get out of that poverty trap, I guess.
It is difficult because the big one there comes through to what we'd normally talk about, like in terms of cash flow. Like the idea, right, is that, yeah, sure, you might be paying, more money over time to buy multiple pairs of shoes rather than buying one good pair that sticks around. But you might only be able to afford that $50 each time, and you never actually physically have $500 cash in bank. And I think that is a real big one. There's often, I think, a real tension or a challenge there where some people go, oh, well, I'll go and get a loan from somewhere. And sometimes that works, but honestly, sometimes that's a bit of a poverty trap itself, where you get yourself into that place where you're starting to pay high interest to people, and it sort of goes and goes over time. So I think, look, always a bit of caution before you go into that. And that goes back to my whole thing of like, in all financial things, it's very rarely a good idea to jump straight in. It's sort of worthwhile to sort of work your way through it. That puts you in a better headspace. It means you can identify any pitfalls before they come through. But it is a big challenge. Sometimes, you're seeing people that might go to their work and say, look, is it possible to get a bit of an advance on my wage for me to get this or similar? Also, sometimes thinking about what the item is, because sometimes it's things that your work maybe could or should or must provide, but they're not currently doing at the moment. If it's steel cap boots for work or whatever it might be, there's things around that you might be able to get support for. So I think it is a real challenge. I mean, cash flow, like how much money you've just got in the bank to spend on your card each and every week. is a tough one. That's also where, though, your emergency fund can come in helpful, because you might go, look, I'll sort of dip into that a little bit just to bridge me over the gap, and then I'll fill back my emergency fund as I go forward.
I think it's nice to also zoom out. And I know that you've been traveling a lot. In terms of all the things that we've talked about, I would say that they're pretty human things, whether you're living in New Zealand or living in London or New York, thinking about your housing, thinking about your cost of living, thinking about insurance and all that kind of stuff, I would assume are similar there too. But are there any sort of noticeable differences that you notice internationally? Oh, Brad, we might have lost you. Hi, Brad. Oh, we have lost Brad, but I think he's rejoining. Hello, Brad. Did you manage to hear my question? Yeah, I hear you.
Yes, I did. Sorry, I thought I was here. Look, I think the big one looking out overseas is that everyone is still finding it tough and similar. But what I really get from people is that, look, life is here for living and they want to do that. They just have to be careful with how they do it. So people are thinking of, sometimes some pretty weird and wacky ways of like, how do they find something still to sort of have those little sparks of joy in life. And that's been a big thing that I have actually really enjoyed, where people have gone, what do I actually enjoy? Because sometimes, look, it might be nice to do all the big sparkly things and what have you. A lot of the time, a lot of the people I've talked to overseas, and I've done quite a couple of trips, they just want a good time out with people that they enjoy spending time with. Now, that's nice if it's at, a nice overseas destination, sitting on the beach, having a swim. If that's not financially in your wheelhouse at the moment, a lot of people are saying, look, I'd actually just like to go over and let's have a drink, let's save up for a nice, nice bottle of wine, or let's go and have make a little cheese board or something, because they actually value spending time with people. It's just what you do while you're interacting is sometimes important as well. But yeah, that's been a big one for me, is people that want to spend time with others. So have that thing in advance. And I know, like myself, I don't get to catch up with some of my friends up in Auckland quite as much. I'm stuck down here in Wellington. We've got a trip. It's not for another 3 or 4 months, but we're not quite counting down the days, but we're sending each other messages. Hey, should we do this while we're sort of catching up? Should we just sort of lie back and have like a lazy day, doing not a lot and watching some rubbish movies? What are those sort of options? Because having something to look forward to is a big one.
I love that. That's such a powerful message to kind of sort of close off on, because we know obviously that saying of like money doesn't make you happy, and really you do need money to kind of at least not worry about basic Maslow hierarchy of needs, your shelter, your food, but then what really actually kind of makes you happy is just spending it time with people that love you and making those memories rather than buying those goods. I want to give you maybe the last few minutes, just kind of share. We've obviously been talking about it in the context of like doing it tough, making sure you can kind of navigate through those tough times. You briefly mentioned at the start around, shifting away from growing my wealth. When should we think about shifting that back to that mindset again?
Look, I think horses for courses, right? Some people will be there at the moment. Other people, it'll take a little bit more time before they're in that position to start thinking about sort of growing their wealth a huge amount more. I think the big thing is to have a little bit of a long-term plan. Now, you don't have to stick to it like every second of every day and be, hard on the grind towards that, but a bit of a direction. Am I heading this way or am I heading that way? Because over time, that means that you can make those small little decisions that will put you a little bit closer to your goal. But honestly, my big one is always, and it is a real strong one, we've got to talk about this stuff a lot more. Like, finances are not something that we are good at managing or good at talking about. The more that we do it, the more that you go and sort of someone says, oh, hey, I went and did this the other day, you go, oh, okay, that's something maybe I can do. I say that because over the last decade or so, I've talked to a lot of friends about, how they use their money. Some people have come up and been like, look, I had no idea that when you took out a credit card that, like, the interest rate was that big, or that if I took cash out on it, it was going to sting me bad. Now I do. Now I talk to a lot of other people. I'm like, hey, if you're going to do this, totally you're cool. Just watch out for these fish hooks and similar. When it comes to going into the bank and that, what are the sort of things you can ask for? Is there that sort of super secret savings fund that might give you a bit more money? Are you thinking about, trying to put all your money into the newest, online crypto something or other, or are you thinking to go a little bit safer? What are the options out there? What do they sort of cost? All of that is done so much easier by talking to people. Now, it's interesting because I think a lot of the time everyone's like, I've got to talk to a real smart person about money. Would love that for everyone. Sometimes that's not super achievable. And I think the big thing is having a collection of people who you generally trust. There are some people as well that I go, you're not the greatest with money and I'm probably not going to talk to you about mine. But have a few people you just sort of gently bounce those ideas off, because often they will spark something in you. You can go and use that. It either means you'll be making more money and making your life a little bit easier. You might not be losing as much. You're thinking of that other opportunity of where you're going on your money journey, but having an idea of what direction you're heading in, what you want your money to do for you, makes a huge difference, because it means you can sort of work on that pathway over time rather than trying to take a real big U-turn right at the end to try and get you there.
I love it. I hope that this webinar really helps people feel that you don't have to feel overwhelmed or that you don't have control, but actually everything that we're saying is there's knowledge out there, whether it's people or websites online, that this is all about you being very intentional about what you want in your life, what stage you're in, where you want to go, and it's very individualized. So feel free to kind of, take that first step, which is just to talk about it, ask for help. Ideally with a professional. We're not professionals, but it gives you a little bit of crowdsourcing to start with. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Brad. Always a pleasure. See you all next time. Bye.
Thanks, man. Bye.